Thank you very much, Mark and Maria, for that very warm welcome. Thank you to Helen as well for inviting me. It's a real privilege to be here, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to have a chat with so many people after the session. I'm looking forward to that very much. It's always a great privilege to come across the ditch, and I'm always a little envious when I do, because so many good things are happening in New Zealand, particularly in the early childhood space. So it's always with excitement, but also, I guess, with a little bit of sadness for me personally, to think that you're able to get on and do so many things that are in many ways more in advance than what we've been able to do to date in Australia. But I bet you can't beat our record for changing your prime ministers as often as what we're managing to do at the moment. I'm not sure that's something that you would want to try and beat. In Australia, it's customary to begin presentations by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. And I would just like to do that here as an Australian visiting you, to acknowledge that for hundreds and hundreds of years, important discussions have been taking place about children, about families, and about education, amongst other things, and that it's a great privilege to be able to also now take part in those sorts of conversations here. I'd also like to pay my respects to traditional elders, current leaders, and future emerging leaders. It's very exciting to have the opportunity to be able to talk with you today about something that's been taking up a lot of my time and I guess thinking space over the last 7 or 8 years now. So in thinking about what might I talk about, it was a little bit hard to know what to focus on, but I thought it's probably best to speak from the heart and to talk with you about something that's actually still quite puzzling for me, because I hope that this will be a talk that will lead to a sharing of ideas and a lot of thinking now, but also as you go away afterwards. And hopefully there may be opportunities to continue via email or some other means. I'd also like to say that my thinking, is the thinking of a lot of Australians around working with our very youngest children, influenced a lot by the really good work that's happening in New Zealand in this space. I'd like to particularly acknowledge the work of Jean McHell here and the amazing work that she's done over many, many years here. So it's lovely, Jean, to be able to connect. And thank you so much for all that you've done to further thinking, to all that you've done today to further thinking in this space, and really looking forward to seeing the things that you're going to go on and do. So, as you can see, I've decided to call this How Can We Understand and Learn from the Experiences of Infants and Toddlers in Early Childhood Settings. So I'm using the term infants and toddlers fairly loosely, I know, and I really like the way Tafaraki refers to overlapping age groups. I'm generally referring here to children up to about the age of 18 months to 2 years, particularly the children who are not yet really at a stage of being able to communicate very readily in words to a wide range of people who might understand. So it's a loose definition that I'm working with here. And this has been just the broad focus that we've been using in a number of research projects that I've been leading. So as part of acknowledging the great work that's going on here, I'd just like to say how great it is to see the New Zealand government in various forms doing a lot of work in this space with very young children. And 3 reports in particular stand out to me. There's the really good literature review that Carmen Daly and colleagues have undertaken. There's the Children's Commissioner's report into understanding out-of-home care for infants and toddlers. And then very recently, just a couple of months ago, I believe, the report by the Education Review Office. So collectively, I think they're really symbolic of the really important attention that's being paid to children in this youngest age group in this country. And I wish I could say that there was equivalent attention and interest in the Australian context, but I'd have to say it's much more variable. I think most of you would know that the Australian system of government is quite different. So we're a federated country, which means that we have 8 governments. No, is it 9? Sorry, losing track. 9 across the country. So 6 state governments, 2 territory governments, and 1 federal government. So it's a very different space. And as you can imagine, there's much more variability. So the state of Victoria is doing some important work here, but most of the other states and territories and the federal government are much less active in terms of the work that they're doing to think about how we might work in more effective ways to advance education and care and professional practice and understandings around infants and toddlers. So I hadn't been aware of this most recent report, so I was very pleased, Mark, when you drew my attention to it. And I've actually taken something from it because it really caught my eye. Actually, I've put the wrong image here, so that's my mistake. So I thought there were great things in this ERO report. One of the things that really did catch my eye, though, was just the general statement about our relationships with infants and toddlers are a really important part of the curriculum, and I don't think there would be anybody who would disagree really with the fact that infant and toddler curriculum really does have to be relationship-based. That's the very, very foundational aspect of it, and without trusting, warm, responsive, respectful relationships in place, then a lot is not possible. But what caught my eye, as you can see here, is the note that in the really responsive centres in New Zealand, that children are experiencing one-to-one interactions that are meaningful and positive. And this is the bit that really stood out for me because it's, it encapsulates so much of what I've been thinking about with the people who form my research team. And they felt respected and cared for. Again, it's not the idea that's contentious in any way, but what I wondered was, so how do we know what they feel? That's the thing for me. So I added the emphasis, and then I was really interested to see the note at the side of the page, that this was determined through observations, discussions with parents and whānau, talking with children where appropriate, and assessment information. So it's really good to see that acknowledgement that it's not at all straightforward to be able to say we know how babies feel. And that's basically what I want to talk about today, and also to reflect on the things that people like myself, people who are doing research, and I would imagine a lot of early childhood professionals who are here today are also researchers, because I know that inquiry into your own practice is a really important part of professional practice in the New Zealand early childhood space. So I guess I'm thinking about all of us, but knowing that we're researching in very different contexts. So it's some thoughts around caution in terms of how much might we really feel we are able to say about how we know about how very young children feel. It's not at all to say that it's not important that we try to understand how they might be feeling, but I think the message that I would like to leave with you is that I think it's incredibly important that we're cautious and tentative, rather than seeing our assumptions about how they might be feeling as things that are just cut and dried. So basically, this talk is going to be about my reflections on, as I said, about 7 or 8 years now of researching infants, babies, lived experiences in early childhood settings. Now, the reason that I've put this image here is that this image actually ended up via social media and a range of other ways, more traditional media, echoing around the world. One of those terms, and I've forgotten, you can see I'm not a sort of social media native, but when something goes viral, that's it. This was an example of something that went viral just overnight, and it's to do with the idea that this young child is wearing a head-mounted camera. So this was only a small part of the project, but it captured a lot of attention. And for a long time, it was actually very difficult for us to talk about this particular research project without somebody bringing up straight away, oh yes, the project where the babies were wearing cameras on their heads. And I noticed yesterday, Mark, that it was something that you brought up too. So it grabbed people's attention for a range of reasons. Just because something grabs attention doesn't mean, of course, that it's a good thing or necessarily a bad thing, but it's interesting to think about, so why does it grab attention? So it's a little bit symbolic, I suppose, this image. So there are two projects that I'm going to be referring to, but the thoughts that I'm going to share apply across both projects. But I thought that I should mention a little bit about the two projects. And this was the first one. Both of them were funded by the Australian Research Council under their linkage project schemes, which means that we also have to have funding from what in Australia is called an industry organisation, at least one industry organisation. And for us, that basically means early childhood service providers or other providers in the early childhood space. So the first one was funded by the Australian Research Council with Family Daycare Australia. Can I just check that family daycare is a term that's familiar to you? Yes. And also with a large not-for-profit provider, KU Children's Services. And we called this project, what is life, or this was the question that we asked, that drove the project, what is life like for infants in early childhood settings? And we tried to have a sting in the tail of this question, and that's the part in bold, from the perspectives of the infants themselves. Because that was the really hard thing to think about. So this project was conducted across family daycare homes and also in 4 early childhood centres across New South Wales. So I'm just, if I remember, I'll refer to this one as Project 1, just because this came first. We were fortunate to get a lot of momentum was developed through this project, and we were really on a roll, and we were just delighted to get funding when that one finished for another project. Apologies that the images haven't come up very well. And this one we call the Babies and Belonging Project. And the driving research question there was, how do babies come to develop a sense of belonging in early childhood settings? And again, the sort of sting in the tail of the question. And if so, how do they contribute to fostering a climate of belonging in the early childhood centre? And this project is currently underway in 4 early childhood centres, 3 of them in the state of New South Wales and 1 in Queensland. So you can see that they are fairly well connected. This is a more focused look in a way at trying to understand what babies' lives are like and how they experience them in centres. And it focuses particularly on belonging, and of course belonging is a key motif in our early years learning framework. So that's sort of the context. They're the projects that I'm going to be drawing upon. And I want to talk a little bit about our research team. This was the research team for the first project, and as you can see, it was a large team, and I'm thinking this was probably taken about 6 years ago, and I think we've all aged during that time quite a lot. It wasn't but because of the research. I think the research in a way kept us young, but it's a realisation that time goes. Now, the reason that I'm showing you the picture of the team is the fact that it was a large team really made a difference for us. It was really a very valuable component of the project. And I guess, as I think so often about the work that I'm doing and my colleagues are doing and the things that we think about and the things that the challenges that we face, in many ways are not dissimilar to the challenges faced by staff teams in centres. You know, they play out differently, but they're the same sort of big issues that I think professionals who are concerned about and interested in and committed to early childhood education think about and puzzle over and sometimes worry about and celebrate, whether they're in an early childhood centre or a family daycare home or in a university or wherever they are. There's a lot of commonality. And I'm thinking here that, well, you know, we know in this particular setting the benefits of working as a team, and I'm sure you're very, very familiar about the benefits of working as a strong team in a centre or a school. But one of the other things that I wanted to mention about this team is that we come from very, very different ways of looking at the world. And I'll show you a little bit just about the discipline backgrounds that we come from. So I'm just going to mention some names because some of you might know some of these people through their writing. Before I do that, though, I want to mention the fact that we started out as 6 researchers, and along the way 3 PhD students joined us, which was just fabulous. 2 of them are in the picture, and I'll introduce them in a minute. But a third person, who's also a very important member of the team, was not here on this day, and that's Sandra Cheeseman. And some of you will know Sandra's name as well. So going around the table from here, Linda Harrison, a developmental psychologist, is very involved in the longitudinal study of Australian children, and she provided much of the early childhood expertise. Then we have a PhD student, Tina Strategos, who writes a lot, who decided to focus her thesis within the bigger research question on the politics of belonging, the politics of infants' belonging in early childhood centres. And fascinating findings and thinking coming out there about just how do day-to-day politics work in terms of children's communities and relationships, and what do they look like, and what does so much, all the things that happen that you could broadly call political, that sort of fly under our typical radar. The next person is another PhD student, Sheena Elwick, and she's ended up writing her thesis around the philosophical and ethical possibilities or impossibilities of really coming to know what infants' experiences are like. And then we have a colleague, Sharon McLeod, who's a speech pathologist, very interested therefore in young children's communication. Fran Press, a very key Australian early childhood policy academic and scholar, me, in my younger days. Ben Bradley, who's been researching in this area longer than any one of the rest of us, and is very well known for his work around babies in groups. He's a social psychologist, is more used to working in laboratory contexts where it's possible to fit babies up, to specially put them in situations and have all the adults go and watch what happens from an observation room. So that's sort of his research background. And then Joy Goodfellow, who I think many of you would know of for her work in understanding early childhood professionals, professional practice, and things like professional wisdom. So we came from very different backgrounds, and again, just a bit of a summary of where we came from. Now, the point about having people from different backgrounds was that it made it more possible that we would bring very different perspectives, perspectives that we wouldn't all hold, and that we would therefore be in a position, in a very collegial way, to challenge each other, to be very surprised by what each other thought, and because of that surprise, to open up a very exciting space where we could no longer really operate from the usual sorts of standpoints, I suppose, that we're used to operating from. And you've probably had that experience, the opportunity to talk with somebody who comes from a very different space, and to be reminded that, gosh, we're not actually all on the same page, and there's some really exciting things that come from being able to have ongoing conversations with people who come from different starting points and different assumptions. So at this stage, we were working with the ideas that Alison Clark and Peter Moss have become very well known for, and you may be familiar with this, the idea of a mosaic approach. And what that basically means, as I've tried to encapsulate through the images, is that by piecing together different understandings that come from looking and listening at a situation through different eyes, thinking about ideas through different theoretical lenses, using different methods to generate data, then using different ways to try to make meaning of that data that have been generated by very different people, including in some cases the children themselves, the researchers, practitioners in the centre, in some case parents. What do you get when you put them all together and try to piece together a picture that makes sense, that's composed of many, many different parts? So that's the basic idea about a mosaic approach. As with any sort of research approach, it's got some strengths and some limitations. And I guess as we got further into this project, we felt that maybe it was a little bit naive, a little bit simplistic to think that just putting together a whole lot of fragments might actually give you a holistic picture. I think it's a bit more complicated than that, but at least it got us underway, and it's certainly been useful to some extent, quite a large extent, although we've probably moved on a bit since then. So the second project, just for various reasons, ended up being a smaller project. So just myself, Ben Bradley, who works with babies in groups, who you saw, and Linda Harrison. So we decided that this time we probably needed to be a little bit more focused, and we decided that we really wanted to focus on what we were calling ethnographies of belonging. So this is the Babies and Belongings project, and we wanted to look at some specific things. So we started out with thinking, okay, how about we really try to have a very detailed look at things like the understandings that people in 4 early childhood centres have about babies and how they belong, or how they don't develop a sense of belonging. And not just the babies, but also the staff who are working with them, and also the families of the babies. But we really wanted to focus primarily on the babies. And it also, I guess, which doesn't go astray when you're trying to get research funding, just convey a little bit of a shock, you know, babies and belonging, the alliteration, and it just, I think, has some has some value in terms of people thinking, gosh, this sounds like it might be an interesting project. We wanted to look at experiences, at practices, the sorts of stories that people tell about belonging, about what they're making sense of as they're trying to understand how babies belong, develop a sense of belonging. We wanted to look at the rituals, some of the structures, the sort of spaces that seem conducive or not to belonging, some of the symbols and the symbolism, some of the actors, both the human actors who seem to be key to developing a sense of belonging, but also the non-human actors, things like objects. I'm sure that you've had experience of objects playing a really important part in young children's lives. So what part did they seem to be playing in helping children develop a sense of belonging or not belonging? And so on. So we have had the opportunity to work with early childhood settings, 4 of them in total, that are in communities where in some ways it might be reasonable to expect that maybe some of the families in the communities could be perhaps in a situation where they may be developing or maybe feeling some sense of marginalisation from the larger mainstream community, if I can even use such a term. So to give you an example of what we were trying to focus on, we didn't want to just go down the road and choose, invite any 4 early childhood centres to work with us. We didn't really want to choose for this project to work with centres where families were in, pretty comfortable circumstances. The centres were pretty comfortable. The staff themselves were all pretty comfortable, however you define comfortable. So one of the centres is, and this is the centre that I'm working with, is in a part of Sydney where there's a very high Muslim population, and for various reasons that you can probably imagine, for some Muslim communities in Sydney, it can actually be a pretty tough time at the moment for a whole lot of reasons. Hopefully you haven't got it here, but from time to time in Sydney, in Australia, there are fairly strong anti-Muslim sentiments being expressed, which are really quite distressing. So it was important for us to try to work with people where, you couldn't necessarily assume that they were feeling a strong sense of belonging. They may or may not. And in many cases, we've actually been finding, and I suppose that's been really good in disrupting our assumptions, that in fact there actually is a very strong sense of belonging. So another setting was in an area where there are high unemployment rates, and again, in many ways, being excluded from the employment opportunities, and therefore in Australia there's a fair correlation between unemployment rates and the degree of poverty in a community, and I think poverty can often tend to have the effect of excluding people or resulting in them feeling a bit marginalised. Another centre is in a community with a high proportion of refugee people from refugee communities, fairly recently arrived refugees, which is different from the community in Sydney that I've been working with, which was a long-established Muslim community. And then another setting is, and this is the Queensland setting, in a community that was established. It's an Aboriginal community, and it was established a long time ago as a mission settlement during that terrible time where a lot of Aboriginal children were removed from their families and Aboriginal communities were dispossessed from their land. And so there's, while the town itself has been well established, there is a long and dark history, I guess, and the effects of that are still being played out. So that just gives a sense of the research sites. So the idea of bringing together 3 different lenses for thinking about the research project Babies and Belonging was that as we look through different research lenses, they tend to lend themselves to different types of questions and to focus on different aspects of what's happening. So you can see that we're trying to move, I guess, in a little bit of continuum. Across the top are listed the research lenses that we use, so developmental psychology, traditionally, I suppose, often associated with child development, sort of a fairly traditional Western child development focus. Some of you would remember the developmentally appropriate practice emphasis, which was an endeavour to work with the fairly traditional child development theories and to translate them into practice. So traditionally, a child development focus will focus on the individual and to think about where are they on a continuum that's generally recognisable within this theoretical lens as more or less the journey we all travel along. And so, as you can see there, for Linda, Linda Harrison, my colleague, looking primarily through this lens, an emphasis on individual babies' relationships, particularly their attachment relationships, and with a particular emphasis on their relationship with their primary caregiver. A sense of security as well. So moving on to the social psychology lens, moving away from focusing particularly on individual children to focusing more on babies in groups. Is there evidence that babies recognise and respond to each other in groups? And if so, what sort of evidence is that? What are they doing as part of a small group together? What sorts of communication styles do they have when they're communicating as a group? How do they read each other's communications? So that's looking at babies as a group rather than an individual. What do others do to facilitate their sociability as a group together, or perhaps to hinder and obstruct their sociability? Then we move on to my interest, which is more from a sociology of childhood lens, I guess, because what I'm really interested in is how do babies as a bigger group, not a group of just 2 or 3s, but as a group of people who live in this space, how do they go about establishing a culture together? What are the rituals? What are they looking for? What do they do to create this culture? And how do they live in this culture? And what sort of expectations do they have of each other, children and adults in the culture? And how do we know about that? And again, the idea of who might be included in this culture. Is it all inclusive, or are in fact some of the babies excluded? Are they excluding others? And if so, how does that seem to be happening? So you can see very different sorts of questions from these different theoretical lenses, but lend themselves to great conversations amongst the research team. So the research team also includes research assistants who are working with us in these sites, because they can actually spend more time in the sites than what we're able to do. So along with each of those different lenses, there are also different specialist research methods. So, and I'm going to show you a couple of these in a minute. So for a developmental perspective, developmental psychology perspective, it's often of interest to know about babies' temperaments. There's a lot of questionnaires, I suppose, rating scales and things that can be used to help people think about that. But what I really want to focus on is use of time use diary. And some of you may be familiar with an attachment cue sort. I'm not actually going to talk about that, but that's a method that involves a sustained period of videoing children, say over a couple of hours, and then looking very closely at that 2-hour video to think about what might that be telling us about babies' attachment relationships. So that's something else that we're going to do. But there are various ways of analysing the data. And again, there's the notion, I suppose, that if you work with lots of different methods and think about what they're telling you, that it hopefully leads to a richer understanding overall. Ben Bradley's work on babies in groups of 2 or 3, their social interactions actually lends itself to very complicated mathematical analyses of behaviour. So that's very interesting as well. And we've also been doing some work about mapping babies' spatial movements through the space of their centre, because things like space and time are very important in terms of getting some insight into the culture of space. So again, just want to walk you through that to give a sense of the diversity of ideas that we're working with. So now I'm just going to go on and give you a sense of some of the ways that we're generating data. And I'm going to start with some that are pretty non-contentious, really. So this was actually inspired by, in part, by the work of the late Judith Duncan, and work that she's done about spatially mapping how people use an early childhood centre. The work that I was particularly interested in was how she tracked, using paper and pen, how adults use the centre, how the staff and the parents, and when the families came into the centre, where did they go and how did they spend their time. So this was from the first project about mapping how a particular child, Charlie, used his time for a period of time. This was in the family daycare home, and in part because of that, you can see a lot of movement back and forth down the main passageway of the family daycare home. This is an infant temperament questionnaire adapted from what was used in the Australian longitudinal study of Australian children, the LSAT data. And it's completed both by caregivers in the centre and also by parents. And part of the point of it is to see how parents and caregivers, educators' ratings might be similar or different. There are strengths and limitations to all these forms of gathering data, but they're fairly well accepted within the traditions in which they're used. The time use diary is probably a little bit more unusual. It's used a lot in social science research generally, but usually by people who self-report on how they spend their time. So it's often being used in studies of housework, who does the housework at home, with the male and the female parent being asked, or the two parents in a family being asked to self-report on how much housework. But it has been used in a range of types of work settings as well. And in another project, colleagues of mine are starting to use it in early childhood settings to understand how early childhood professionals are spending their time and what they're focusing on. But in this case, what we wanted to use it for was to record at 5-minute intervals what a particular child was doing to build up a sense of their day. So what we were doing, and I wasn't particularly in part of this, but as you can see towards the bottom, I'm interested in recording at 5-minute intervals over a period of different sessions, but to build at the end a record of a child's typical day, what the child was doing, where the child was, inside or outside, and who the child was with, in broad categories, whether the child was alone, with an educator, or with other children. So as you can imagine, to do that for an individual child, for 5 minutes every 5 minutes for 2-hour sessions, and aiming for about 4 2-hour sessions at different times of the day, so that we could sort of stitch together more or less what a typical day looked like, but excluding things like toileting time and rest time, generated a lot of data. This is what the diary looked like. So it's actually very taxing for people who were completing it, because it meant that they really had to focus. So as you can see there, 15-minute intervals broken into 5, and then 3 for every 5 minutes, and then a whole list of things to be marked to give a sense of what the child was basically doing. And of course, it doesn't take away from the fact that children are often doing many things at once, so people have to make a call there about maybe what the key thing was. But what it did enable us to do was to look at both an individual children and children as a whole, to get a sense of, within these settings, how much time were they spending alone, how much time were they spending with educators, with other children, how much time were they spending indoor, outdoor, or perhaps in a transition undercover area. And as you can see there from some of the figures, it varied markedly across the different settings. So it certainly started to reinforce that children's experiences of early childhood settings are very, very different, even within the one centre, even within the one family daycare home where there may be only 4 children. So here's some data from a family daycare home and just 2 children. So Charlie and Bianca. Charlie is the child whose data has been aggregated in the red, and this is what, from an afternoon, recorded over a 2-hour period. So as you can see, there were some things that were similar for these 2 children and some things that were quite different. You'll notice that the time spent alone varied really, quite drastically. That Charlie, of that 2-hour period, spent 50 minutes alone. Bianca spent about 5 minutes alone. And the reverse was so in terms of time they spent with the educator. Some things were more similar, but you can see, for example, a big difference in terms of how much time they were spending. We use the term wander. It was difficult to know what term to use for a lot of these things, but we don't mean wander disrespectfully. We mean wander in terms of checking things out, I suppose, but using the space a lot. But what is interesting to know, which you wouldn't know from this graph, is that Bianca was a child of the family daycare educator. So that explains. And that led us to think about, so how is the experience different for children who are, whose parents are actually in their educational space? So we could do different things. Here's in a centre, and this pattern was different from children in a family daycare home. So it enables lots of analyses. This is what it can look like when it's put together statistically. So what this is actually looking at is an aggregation of green is time for adults, with adults, blue when children are alone, purple for when they're spending meal times together. And you can see that the ebb and flow of the day. They're doing different things, understandably. I mean, we know that at different times of the day, but it starts to enable us to think in different ways, I think, about time and what are children doing across the day, because it just looks such a different form of representation, and different forms of representation are often very powerful. So this is where, and just one more quick look. We used a lot of video, but what we found even more useful than the video really was to then look at stills of the video and look to see what was happening, say in a 90-second clip of video across, we could look at up to about 90 stills in a minute and a half of video, like 1 per second. That was too much to really grasp, but it was amazing what we noticed when we looked at things at the stills. So, for example, this is a narrative that we called Charlie Comes to the Cash Register, and these are the two children whose time use you saw. Charlie, the little boy in the blue, Bianca, the child of the family daycare educator. She was playing with a toy cash register. He was interested in coming and joining her. It took him a while to climb up on the chair, but this is all within a minute and a half. And I guess the point of that minute and a half is you wouldn't necessarily see it if you didn't look at it via stills. Each time we looked at the stills, we could see more. So he's expressing interest in being involved. He's looking at her, we think for, and again, we think, we don't know, for some indication, can I join you? What are you thinking about this? How does it work, etc. She was withdrawing, not very interested in engaging, maybe didn't want to engage with him. And her mother, the educator, noticed this happening and she said, "Oh, Bianca, show Charlie the cash register." He looked, social referencing, he looked at the educator, you can see here as she said that. And then in the next, he looked back to her to say, "Oh, come on, you heard what your mum said, show me a bit about this." Bent right around, looked in his face, but she wasn't interested. So he had one more go, craning his body around to try to engage her in that. And then it ended, she left and he left. And it was sort of, we felt for him, well, mission not really accomplished, in that particular instance. But the point of it was 90 seconds, incredibly difficult to pick up that fine degree of detail unless you've got the opportunity to really look. So this is where things get risky. And I'm not going to make any real judgments, I suppose, about this, but I'd like to leave these images with you to think about. So there were two things where I felt we were going out on a limb, and I have very mixed views about this. So one is the baby cam that I already referred to, and the reason that we called it baby cam was because we brainstormed the idea. It was in the middle of the summer. There's a lot of cricket on the TV, like we just come back from leave, and there was a lot of talk about what cameras were picking up, the stump cam, I think, like camera mounted on the stumps. That was relatively new. So we thought, well, what would be the possibilities, what would be the pros and cons of trying to really understand what it's like at looking at things through infants' eyes, babies' eyes. What would maybe a head-mounted or headband-mounted camera enable? Now, this isn't new in the sense that developmental psychologists have been using it in laboratory conditions, but it was fairly new in a naturalistic setting. And coincidentally, we later became aware that Jane White at Waikato was also developing this type of approach, and she refers to it as polyphonic images. So I want to talk a little bit about baby cam, and I want to talk also a little bit about something quite new that we're trying, and that's GoPro. You might be familiar with GoPro cameras. A lot of cyclists in New South Wales anyway wear them on their camera to record what motorists are doing or not doing. So let's just have a quick look at this. So we did go to a lot of effort to, we were very careful of the ethical issues associated with children wearing cameras, and it was very, very difficult. We had to go through a lot of testing to find something that met Australian safety standards, that were comfortable, that seemed to be comfortable for children. We only made sure we only used them for very, very short periods of time, and only if the children seemed to be feeling comfortable with them. We had the very young daughter of one of our research assistants who later became a PhD student who tested and gave feedback on the cameras. I won't tell you about how part of our search led us to private eye companies who were testing surveillance cameras, small surveillance pocket hole cameras and things for their line of work, because we wanted to go as small as possible. So that's sort of what it looked like. Some children didn't want to wear them at all, and that was fine. But some children were quite excited and seemed to sort of associate this as something that they did with the research assistant. But what does it enable? What did it enable? So we used a normal camera and the head-mounted camera. We couldn't get it really quite over their eyes. But it enabled us to look and think about things differently. So on the left, it's the image through the baby cam, and on the right, the typical image. So it enables something as simple as mealtime. This was in another family daycare home, and the educator, who's an absolutely wonderful practitioner, approaching the baby and just starting to feed them. And you can get a sense of how the scale is quite different, can't you? And just how things might look really different for children than what we typically think. We're all used to the idea that it's important to be down low with children. Another educator in another family daycare home really made a particular point of always sitting on a very low stool or on the floor. But when we were all looking with her at the baby cam footage from her setting, it was still really astounding to her just how much of the image focused on people's legs and furniture legs. So it was a very different view of the world, and just how high, relatively speaking, the boundary of the sandpit is. So it enabled us to think about things differently. There are lots of complexities, should I say, or I could say, about using this, and we decided not to pursue this further for a range of reasons. This is what some of us are doing and thinking about the GoPro camera, and basically I'm just going to show you, because we're just coming to an end now, explaining what we're doing, why we're doing it. I'm just going to leave you with some questions that I'm not really going to respond to, because I don't know how I feel about this at the moment, and I think that's part of research, not jumping to conclusions too quickly about what might be enabled and not enabled. So a GoPro camera, you can take video footage, but we're using it to take a photo every 10 seconds because, again, because of the earlier project, we really came to understand the value of looking at stills. And it can be put in one place in the room, and because it's got a broad scope, you can see almost the entire room, or you can move it around if you want to. So what it enabled us to do was to have the one camera and to get a sense of pretty much the entire room with a bit of distortion. So we're then able to take a map of the room, to divide it into squares, metre squares, that enabled us to set up a grid with coordinates on it that we could use to map in a more accurate way than that earlier hand-drawn diagram where the children were. And we're using a database, and you may be able to see the green tick for the focus child, and then there are other children. So we can actually map where they are using this system. Here's the grid, the map of the room. This is in the centre in Queensland, in a rural Aboriginal community. Lovely centre, lovely, very comfortable sense of, it seemed to us, everybody feeling very comfortable in the space. So our focus child here is the little child in blue at the back, And I'm just going to show you a sequence of images over, taken not sequential, but fairly close to sequentially in a 90-second period. And a lot actually changes. As you know, children of this age, not quite there yet, can move very quickly. So this is all part of what the database looks like and the dashboard. So, okay, so here we are, the child in the blue t-shirt, and things that are happening over a period of, you know, just a very brief period. So while we were focusing on this particular child, looking at this bit of data, we could have switched the focus at any stage to look at where the educator was in the room, how many children are with the educator, what the other children are doing. And again, it enables us to have a very close look. But what it then enables us to do is to represent that data in a range of different ways. So the different circles here represent how much time was spent in different areas. This is the educator and where the educator was. And this is the total time spent and the traffic pathways through the room in this 90-second period. So I guess the question that I'm leaving with you, which is one that I'm puzzling over, is this can be done, you know, with technological advances. Things can be done. What is a good use of time? What is a good use of our time? Just because something can be done, is it a good thing to do? What are other ways that we might think about going about understanding what very young children are experiencing and understanding from their time in early childhood centres? How can we stretch our ways of thinking about how we gather that data, no matter where we are, whether we're working in centres or just people going into centres every now and then, more as a research role? How can we stretch our thinking about the possibilities? Because I think that it is so important to be thinking about how can we be informing ourselves as much as we possibly can while remaining still quite tentative and cautious, knowing that we can never understand for sure just how children, particularly very young children, are experiencing what we think we are providing for them. So thank you very much for listening to that, and I hope that in some ways there might be a way to continue that discussion. Thank you.
What an interesting presentation. Thank you so much, Jennifer. I first remember being in touch with Jennifer 12 years ago, and some of the things that really impressed me about her at the time, I think that we've seen in this afternoon's presentation, and that is a real respect for children, a huge amount of humility and integrity in what she does, and some real richness in terms of the experiences and the real reflections on them. So I think she is a wonderful role model for us all in terms of where we're at and the ways that we are observing and thinking about young children's experiences. So I think you've really pushed us with some interesting provocations around methods, because those provocations apply to many of you that are teachers as well in the settings that you're in. So thank you very much for that, Jennifer. And I'd just like to now open the floor to questions or responses or further puzzlings and provocations. I think you've really opened up, not quite Pandora's box, but almost when we think about observations of the kids and toddlers. So any questions or responses? Jean's still thinking, but I know there'll be one.
Hi. I heard you say that it's important to be cautious and attentive and to not make assumptions.
Yes.
What do you mean by doing that?
Yes, and that's really interesting that you picked that up, because that was a big point of discussion for us. Some of us felt that that was a disrespectful term to use, and others felt that it was important to come up with a term that conveyed that people don't always have to be doing something, that it's fine to have time where you just might, that you might be, like you just may not be doing anything in particular, but who knows what you might be thinking about, if you are thinking about something, or whether you're just having a quiet space. So thank you for picking up on that. That sort of symbolises, I guess, or goes really to the heart of a lot of the conversations we had about what are respectful ways to be able to convey ideas, and some of our ways were better than others, some of our language was better than others. Yeah.
Did that resonate with you for some reason?
Yeah, well, I just thought that it was kind of like downplaying the child's mind.
Yes.
Like not taking into consideration
Yes.
that the child might be actively thinking, but physically.
Yes.
Still.
Yes, yes. And part of that is they may well have been actively thinking, or they may well have just been being without thinking, and who are we to say what they were really doing? And yeah, I don't think doing nothing is a very good term, but yeah, very interesting.
After the whole research, do you whole team that actually suggest to like reduce the ratio? Like normally
Oh,
you
yes.
1 to 4, 1 to 5.
Yes.
So after the research, do you personal or your team thinking that it would be better to reduce?
Not so long ago, the ratio was improved for children in Australia, for children under, of this age. It was pretty shockingly 1 to 5. So it's since been reduced to 1 to 4. I mean, it would be much better to have a better ratio. But I think at the moment, the big thing that people are really trying to hang on to, and it's very much a case of hanging on, but who knows, we have a new Prime Minister now, so things might be different tomorrow, are really worrying, backpedaling from the minimal educational qualifications, and a recommendation actively under consideration by the previous Prime Minister was to only require a minimum of a certificate level qualification for people working with children aged under 3. So that was a big backstepping. So we're trying to hold on to that at the moment, lobbying really hard to retain that rather than going again for ratios. What is it in New Zealand at the moment? 1 to 4, is it?
1 to 5.
Oh, okay. Right, okay. Yes, yes. No, thank you.
It's an interesting question, because I used to have that parallel that, if a mum had triplets, that she got home help.
Yes.
And yet somehow, rather in an early childhood setting, a qualified or unqualified teacher, or person in the role of a teacher, was somehow able to manage,
Yes.
caring and educating for 5. I mean,
Yeah, it is ridiculous. Something just went into my mind. So what was really interesting though, Helen, I'm just thinking of your point and prompted by your question, thank you, is in the ERO report, the finding that, and those of you who are familiar will know that centres were classified as, I think, being highly responsive, quite responsive, or, and not very responsive, and I forget the exact terms. But interestingly, there wasn't a correlation with ratios or qualifications or some of the other structural components of quality. So, it's really interesting on the one hand, and yet it can be potentially dangerous on the other. So research isn't innocent in a way. Like it can lead to some dangerous situations. So that really struck me because that's the argument that the Productivity Commission in Australia, and just note that term, that's where early childhood sits under the productivity agenda, that their point was that there wasn't good research to show that ratios or qualifications make a difference. Now there is, but there's conflicting research. So the ERO report will only just add to the contestation. So very interesting. Yes.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Jennifer. I really appreciate both what Helen has said in the sense of the care and the attention to the ethical sort of space. I think this speaks to us in another kind of a way that's beyond the research, in that we have become somewhat camera happy within our approaches inside centres, where absolutely every moment sometimes seems to be a moment to capture. And the sort of the concerns I think you've raised about the progress of technology always being good. So as most of us know now with the social media connection, the image can be instantly online, and the expectation within a sort of a consumer sort of society that a centre may start to brand itself around offering images online straight away, or surveillance in disguise. We can watch what's going on in the crib or wherever else. So I think the fact that we don't shy from engaging in research like this, that enables us to open a debate in a way that is informed. I mean, for people who don't know Jane's research, Jane doesn't have one camera on the infant. She has a camera on the researcher and a camera on the friend, the peer, and a camera on the teacher. So it's sort of, but again, with a real commitment to working around the idea of what we are trying to be aware of and careful of, so that we can inform debates around visual research methodology.
I think that's a really good point, John. I know Stephanie will, I hope you remember, verify those to talk about the early childhood paparazzi. Yes. Yes, and when we started to talk about assessment and the documentation that goes with that, because I agree with you. I think that's a huge concern that for children something's only being seen to be worthwhile if someone takes a photo of it, and preferably several photos, and that's actually, it changes the value of the engagement as well. So I think there are possibly different messages around what would happen in research and different things that might happen with teachers in practice, and that it's all, you're quite right. Visual methodologies have kind of been coming as this new but cool thing, but there are so many concerns that we haven't gotten to the bottom of yet around the use of images and the potential for surveillance as well.
Can I just make another connection?
Yeah.
Super quick. Jane and a group of other people in universities around the world are working on a new journal and supported it through a learning society.
Yes.
I'm sure you know of it.
I am aware of it. It's very exciting.
Right,
So yes.
Because that would then help this kind of message, the visual journal of pedagogy and education.
Yes. Yes.
With Springer.
Yes. No, it's going to be a very exciting space, and I guess another example of New Zealand taking the lead. Yes.
I was just curious about how the relationships with the families would be different in the four settings to do with the rituals, in terms of how you would investigate the impact of that on that sense of belonging.
Yes, yes. So we're not at that stage yet, Jean, of the research. We're getting to that quite soon. And again, I'm not sure that I'm going to really be able to answer your questions, so tell me if I'm getting off track. But it's just so clear, as you would well know, that different families in centres have different rituals, and the importance of the awareness of and the appreciation of different rituals as part of the richness of centre life. But it does seem to me that rituals anywhere can be very important in terms of fostering a sense of belonging. And that some rituals can be very productive of fostering a sense of belonging, and others can be very unproductive. I don't know that that's
It's just such
helped.
a fascinating range across your
Yes.
senses. And I
Yes.
think that was great that you carefully selected those where you're going to be
Yes.
yes. coming through with those differences.
Yes, so they are extremely different. You had got, I think, from the centre in the Indigenous community, probably a sense of the space and ease. In the centre that I'm spending most time at, which is the centre in the community in Sydney where there's a very high Muslim population, a very small babies room, like it's about 3 metres square, 4 metres square, like tiny. And when I first walked in, it reminded me of a novel that I'd read over Christmas that was called The Room, and it was very real life. It was a novel, but it was written from the perspective of a young woman who'd been abducted, as tends to happen a bit in the US, and kept captive, who'd had a baby to her captive, and so the mother and child were growing up in the space of a room. And it talked about the very rich life that they actually had in this room, even though they were captive. And there was just a real sense of, even though the room in the centre was so small, the richness of the relationships between the educator and the babies, to me, seemed to give a richness that was missing in some of the settings where there was, much more generous space. So again, that interrupted a lot of my assumptions, I suppose.